Greetings and salutations. It is I, Mr. Nothing, the museum curator of the weird and the strange, and the host who might be a ghost. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual literature that I have found in my travels through the gardens. It is another glorious Poetry Thursday, a day where I can talk about a variety of poetry, but for some reason I find myself drawn to poetry about bees, because in the past I've recounted at least two poems about bees. One which is used as an analogy for disappointing children, and the other one is used as a metaphor for a failed marriage. I wasn't 100% clear on that. But if you think I'm about to do something different now, you're wrong, because I have found yet another poem about bees. Wonderful, wonderful bees. It seems to be a growing trend. And I've just decided, in between talking about, other poetry that can be sometimes weird, I'm just going to start talking about bees. Because there's countless number of poems out there that feature bees in some sort. I'm determined to find every single one of them. So what poem did I find today that would be bee related? Well, I have found one by a notable poet. The poem that I will be talking about today is The Bee by Emily Dickinson. For those who are unaware of who Emily Dickinson is, and if you're coming to Poetry Thursday and you don't know who Emily Dickinson is, a lot of questions raised there. But Emily Dickinson was a poet who lived between the 1830s and the 1880s. She was a pretty rad poet. One of my favorites, just because she wrote probably what is probably my favorite poem of all time. Lots of good contenders out there, but I think the answer is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. It's a wonderful poem about death, and that's what Emily Dickinson was known for, I think. Poems about death and sex and immortality and stuff like that. So she was known for writing about stuff like that. She was also known for being a recluse, staying in her room for long periods of time. People have speculated that she might have had depression. I don't know how true that is, but based on her poems and the fact that she led a somewhat tragic life filled with death and sadness and loneliness, it seems. I would say, yeah, she fits the textbook description of depression in some form. It's just unfortunate that it never seemed to get resolved for her in her lifetime. Mainly probably because she lived in Victorian times, and they weren't necessarily good at detecting any problems that came up when women. So unfortunate for her. Another thing I found when I was looking up Emily Dickinson is that she might have been a lesbian, maybe gay. A lot of people have speculated that, although there's no direct evidence that she was gay. We can only speculate, and sometimes it's wrong to speculate about whether people in history were gay. But if you're looking for that representation, maybe Emily Dickinson. I wouldn't say for 100%, but it is interesting to see how she lived her life. And one last thing I want to note is that she only published 10 poems and maybe a couple letters before she died. A lot of her work went largely unpublished until after her death, when family members started posting her work, and people scoured through it and were like, hey, this is pretty good. Although a lot of her work was transformed to fit traditional poetry styles because, I don't know, just because that would look better to some people. But I think that's kind of doing a disservice to her legacy there. If it doesn't fit conventional poetry styles, who's to say that it's really her work? You're just adapting what you think would look good. And then there's the problem of digging through somebody's work after they're dead and then publishing it. Like, there's a reason they didn't go out and publish it. Like, for Emily Dickinson, it might have been that she was shy or like didn't want that much attention. But that's a valid reason for not publishing something. But for other people, it just might be that their work sucks and they know it and they don't want to publish. So don't publish it because you're dragging down their name. I know that a lot of people were unhappy with Ghost Set of Watchmen by Harper Lee. A lot of people felt that she was being exploited as she neared the end of her life. Or he. I actually don't know who Harper Lee is. But anyways, yeah. So like. A lot of people felt that it was like exploitative, but it also wasn't as good as To Kill a Mockingbird. So exploitative in some way. I can see that I'm rambling on about Emily Dickinson. So let's get to the poem. I'll first talk about the poem and then do a little analysis, and we will move on from there. So here is The Bee by Emily Dickinson. Like trains of cars on tracks of plush, I hear the level bee. A jar across the flower goes their velvet masonry, which stands until the sweet assault their chivalry consumes, while he victorious tilts away to vanquish other blooms. His feet are shod with gauze, his helmet is of gold, his breast a single onyx, his chiroprace inlaid. His labor is a chant, his idleness a tune. Oh, for a bee's experience of clovers and of noon. All right, so let's discuss this wonderful poem. I'll put a link to it in the description so you can find it, read it, and we can discuss it in the comments below. That would be pretty wonderful. Yeah, so one thing that really stands out to me is how she describes the bee. Emily Dickinson, contrary to like how other people might describe a bee as like a noisy or buzzy or like kind of a pain, Emily Dickinson kind of gives it a very chivalrous, knight-like quality. She specifically says their chivalry consumes. Chivalry would be a very knight-like quality attributed in the Middle Ages to, knights in particular. She also says, while he victorious tilts away to vanquish other blooms. So again, you got chivalry and you got a bee fighting the blooms for their nectar, and it's very like a knight fighting off the hordes of enemies so that they may win the hand of a fair maiden or impress some king or whatever it is knights did during the Middle Ages. She also says his helmet is of gold. So like describing the bee's head as a helmet. Who else wears a helmet? A knight. So it's pretty clear to see she's describing the bee as a very, I guess, beautiful creature. But also very knight-like, regal, robust. Another thing I want to point out, like as I mentioned before, she talked about sex and death, and that's not really featured in this poem. But I also noted that she had depression, or a lot of people speculate that she might have had depression. And I can honestly see this being a depression poem. Like, Emily Dickinson is sitting in the garden as some sort of like therapy for herself. And she sees a bee stumble by, and she's like, yes, I enjoy that bee. What it would be like to be happy as a bee instead of this sad, grotesque mess. She never says that, but you could make an argument for it. But again, it's not indicated in the text, so not 100%. I just want to say how Emily Dickinson's backstory might influence the reading of this poem in some way. So again, that was The Bee by Emily Dickinson, a wonderful poem. I always enjoy Emily Dickinson's poem because it has a different vibe to it. I think just because of how she was during her life. It might just be that all these poems were slightly altered after her death, which would be terrible. But I guess that's how it goes. But I really like the vibe that Emily Dickinson's poems give off, including Because I Could Not Stop for Death. I would definitely say seek this out, find it, read it. Read her other poems because Emily Dickinson is pretty groovy. Leave a comment below if you have something to say about this poem or you disagree with my analysis. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people may learn about Emily Dickinson if they do not already know, and we can we can work her more into Poetry Thursday. Otherwise, I wish you the best of times in your weird and bee-ish travels. Farewell.